It brings me so much hope to see that we're all on the same mission of supporting biodiversity so beautifully. And I've learned so much from all of you, and I am grateful to be able to share the practices and approaches of the US ecological horticulture movement as well. Let's see. Yoink. Nope. Is this? Okay, here we go. All right, great. So I'm from New England in the northeastern US, where I grew up on a small farm gardening and spent my very wild youth working in art and fashion and then ecology. But I never really fell in love with anything until I found horticulture. And it was urban ecological horticulture specifically. So I moved to New York City and worked there for most of my career, cultivating beautiful and biodiverse landscapes on public lands in some of the harshest conditions imaginable. I was head gardener for historic Washington Square Park in Manhattan, which is old by our standards, as well as the center of political action in New York City. Just about every protest march ends there for a rally, and it was at that park that I became a dedicated public servant, recognizing the role that stewards play in holding and shaping these critical spaces for democracy. I then went to Brooklyn Bridge Park, where I worked for a decade, helping to build and run this massive public works project, the largest in Brooklyn in over a century, turning these derelict shipping piers into a world-class public park. The designers of the park, Michael von Valkenburg and Associates, always intended it to provide habitat to New York City wildlife as well as habitat to New York City people. They hiked mountains in the region to look at rock faces and trail slopes. They assessed the views that people were drawn to in natural settings, and then shaped Brooklyn Bridge Park to give urban people similar experiences. New York City can be oppressively flat, and so they would put in hills so kids could run down hills, and paths that would give people the experience of exploring a woodland path in a safe and accessible way. And the hope was that animals might do the same thing, that they would recognize this construction as real land. In many ways, it was an experiment in constructed ecology. As director of horticulture, I recognized this as the best possible laboratory in which to track and support diversification, as well as to pull lessons from the process and share what we learned with other institutions trying to do similar things. And that was my role while I was there, overseeing construction, managing a crew, caring for the landscape, encouraging biodiversity, designing when necessary, and then communications and education with parks, gardens, and the public. The whole project was so much more successful than I think any of us ever imagined. The park hosts more than 5 million people each summer, and the Hort crew is now up to over 20 people, including arborists, interns, and a fleet of gardener/ecologists who care for the landscape but also conduct experiments and observe how animals, plants, and people all interact there together in the middle of the largest city in the entire country. And it really seems to be working incredibly well. The park has attracted rare birds, critically imperiled bumblebees like Bombus fervidus here, as well as endangered plants. And just tons of these wildly charismatic animals who people love. Our work was about creating habitat, that was central, but it was also about introducing these animals to people and demonstrating how wonderful they can be. Brooklyn Bridge Park is one of only 4 locations in all of New York City to have populations of the walking stick you see here. And we have a glowworm population so spectacular that people come and put down picnic blankets to watch the show in July. Before first, I forgot to mention, we had the first sighting of the 2-spotted lady beetle in New York City in 30 years. Yeah, it was amazing. And those populations are now radiating out from the park. You can actually track them. It's pretty cool to see. And so none of this is by chance. We would go after these populations, figuring out how to attract and support them. The park is made up of mostly, but not exclusively, native plants, And we only used organic management practices. And we would research the life cycles of the animals and plants we thought could thrive in the park, and then assess how our management practices interacted with them, and then adjust when necessary in order to encourage populations. We don't say glowworms. We call them fireflies or lightning bugs, depending on where you're from. And after the park had been operational for 7 years or so, we noticed that we had a small population of them. But it was clear that the park experience would be that much richer with a spectacular light show, and so I researched what sorts of habitat and food sources that fireflies require, and shared that information with the Hort staff, requesting that everyone find locations in their zones where we could leave wet leaves all year round without impacting the design or like watering just a pile of leaves. And it took a couple of years, but one of the gardeners, Pavel Plyazinski, who is an incredible naturalist and had left wet leaves in his zone, started to see population increases just by casual observation and then by watching the people watch the fireflies. He wasn't setting up quadrants. We were big fans of what we called bad science, where we could experiment and test hypotheses, but it was quite rare, sadly, that we had the resources to publish anything properly. But many of the gardeners had degrees in ecology, including myself, and we were able to definitively determine the effects of our actions, as well as conduct surveys and work with local entomologists and bird experts. We learned a lot about how planting design fosters habitat. But as the stewards of that land, what we focused on, and what was a bit of a revelation to us, was how much our garden management dictates the quality of habitat in a landscape. It's not just the species and arrangements of plants, although that is central, but the way that we conduct ourselves in the garden that dictates if ground birds will nest or if specialist pollinators will actually reproduce. And that's what I'm going to focus on today with this short time. Just a couple of management strategies that we found to be the most helpful, and how we determined which strategies to experiment with. Not long ago, we used to call working in the garden maintenance, which we soon realized was just not an accurate description of this sort of work, especially in dynamic systems. We then moved to the word management, which gives the landscape a bit of agency and made a bunch of gardeners feel super important for a while, but it's still a little bit corporate for my tastes. Some people use stewardship, and while I use all of these terms once in a while, the word I keep going back to is care. We are taking care of land with this sort of work. We're not just imposing our will, but considering what the land wants to be and what the ecological communities and human communities need in order to thrive. More than anything these days, I think about this time of gardening as simply an incredibly pretty way to take care of land. I love this framing because it puts us in the landscape, not just over it. We're actors and helpers and friends of birds. Many people have a pretty bleak opinion of humanity these days. I like to remind us that the problems we're facing aren't due to our species necessarily. Biodiversity decline is the result of a very specific set of practices and views that we can change. The sorts of extractivist, consumerist, colonialist relationships to land that so many of us grew up with do not need to be what we carry into the future. We can protect the ecological diversity that remains, cultivate it on our land, and even build it when necessary. And a lot of that in our movement centers around the protection and planting of native plants. These are plants that evolved on the land that we're working on, and alongside and sometimes at the behest of local wildlife. In the US, nearly all of our ecologically based design work contains a majority of native plants. 70% is the number we usually strive for, unless we're working on an actual restoration or in an ecologically sensitive area. But those plants are central. We use them as building blocks, as the bases of systems that we're trying to support, with the intent to lure back animals and fungi who have relationships with those plants. If I understand it properly, it's sort of a mirror image of the way that your rewilders use wildlife, placing animals back in the landscape and then hoping that they lure the plants back. I'd love to hear more about that, but in a large city park, plants are just much easier to work with than pigs. And again, we see those plants as central. But there are people who see a bee on a flower and think, aha, that is great. The bees are happy, we must be doing things right. And they very well might be, but it's possible that that's not the case. In the US, a full quarter of our bee species are specialists, which means that they need the pollen of certain species, genera, or families of plants to provision their babies. And when that pollen isn't available, they will often forage elsewhere, and sometimes they suffer in ways that gardeners cannot see. The average larvae may be smaller, fewer, or fail to develop at all. It's also important to remember that we're not just feeding bees here. We're only now discovering the true complexity of pollen and nectar and the way that animals use them. Bumblebees in the US will self-medicate with sunflower pollen to clear out gut parasites. Apparently, it's actually the shape of the pollen that does it. While your native heather similarly cures bumblebees of parasites, but uses a chemical called coulounine, discovered at Kew. Nectar is a veritable witch's brew with alcohol, yeasts, and amino acids that pollinators rely on. In eastern North America, our ruby-throated hummingbirds will visit many flowers in our gardens. But only those tubular red and yellow flowers that they evolved alongside of contain nectar curated just for them, with the viscosity, sugar content, and amino acids necessary to sustain their extreme energy use. Same with berries. Many US studies have shown that our native songbirds prefer native berries, but newer research also shows that when compared to invasive species, native fruits have the nutritional value that birds require in order to keep them healthy. The birds have selected fruit with high lipid concentrations for centuries. We focus our efforts on supporting these pre-existing relationships rather than trying to establish new ones. And then, of course, there are the lepidopterans, the butterflies and moths who require their host plants in order to reproduce. There absolutely are instances where lepidopterans have figured out how to use exotic species, even preferring them to native plants. You can even get a monarch butterfly to eat leaves of plants that are not milkweed. It takes dozens and dozens of generations and a kill rate above 95%, but it is possible. While other novel food sources have been seen to change behavior and migration patterns of butterflies, we just don't know enough yet to say if this is good or even okay. The safest thing to do is to make sure that these animals have access to the plants that they've relied on for so many years. It's about keeping those communities intact. Because this work is not also just about animals. We want the plants to thrive as well. And many of them also rely on pollinators and seed distributors. And they can suffer when those partners go elsewhere. Your purple loosestrife is invasive in the US as it pushes out native wetland plants, but pollinators love it. And they love it more than our native wildflowers. A study a few years ago found that when researchers mowed purple loosestrife, pollination and seed production of native plants in the area shot up drastically. We strive to manage our landscapes as systems that cultivate dynamics among whole networks of organisms. And again, it's about supporting those communities. And of course, people are one of the most important communities to support when gardening. And so please don't think I'm asking you to rip out peonies or anything of the like. Many of the plants that support wildlife can fit happily among or around them, like this gorgeous knapweed that I keep seeing around. I've heard people say here that we've changed the land so much with climate change and urbanization that native plants just have no place in our cities. And in the US at least, with our varying definitions of the word native, that's just not true. There are plants for high and low pHs, wet and dry, construction rubble, you name it. We have the diversity. This is a garden I designed for the front of the Brooklyn Museum. These plants are in 18 inches of soil in one of the busiest intersections in all of Brooklyn, with no gates or fences to protect them from New Yorkers and their dogs, and it still reads as ornamental. The goal was to lure people in with beauty and then sneakily introduce them to their regional ecology, plants included. It's nonstop flowers from spring until frost, and I used many butterfly host plants and flowers that would attract charismatic pollinators. And when I say that these are native plants, wow, am I being liberal with that term. There are local ecotype plants grown from seed gathered within New York City in this planting, and the vast majority are species that can be found within New York State. But there are plants from the Midwest with no natural occurrences in the East, as well as cultivars with longer bloom times or shorter stature. I've heard some of you use the term near native to describe the plants that live in Europe and would likely come back to the UK over time. And that's a much closer assessment to the sorts of liberties we often take when deciding what to plant. But of course, every garden is different. But for the front of the Brooklyn Museum, it had to read as chic. And so I prioritized aesthetics and functionality. I wanted milkweed for the monarchs, but I didn't want the pink color, so I used a white cultivar. Thankfully now, the state of research and commercial availability is such that I can look up if that cultivar is any less attractive to monarchs, and it's perfectly fine. Which is all to say that the bar isn't as high as it is sometimes presented to be. I selected for plants that I knew would be able to survive foot traffic and sidewalk salt, but while reading as beautiful to the hot dog vendors on the corner, but would still have relationships with local wildlife like that milkweed. And so far, it's working great. We've had more than 20 species of native bees that were recorded in the first year alone. And I think, I'm pitching this so hard because we've seen it work so well. And I honestly just think it would be cool to see what you could do if you made ornamental gardens of your regional flora. But the following strategies are what we found to work in any garden, even a formal border. Many wonderful people have been talking about the importance of structure and complexity in garden habitat, and how that interlocking tangle of plants creates niches for all sorts of animals. I'd like to encourage gardeners to bring that complexity to the ground layer as well, to the fallen leaves and twigs and other things that we often rake out. This leaf layer is there for a reason. Deciduous trees and smaller plants aren't throwing their leaves away in autumn. They're carefully placing them over their root systems, where they insulate the soil and hold in moisture. Over time, as those leaves break down, they can raise or lower soil pHs and shift soil ecosystems from bacterially dominated over to fungally dominated systems. Leaves are one of the main tools that plants use to create the soils that they want to live in. It's a method of terraforming. And when we rake them out, even to compost them and put them back, we disturb those processes. In the US, we have a cute saying of leave the leaves. They're literally called leaves. We should leave them. Because, it's cute. They're not only important for the plants, they help us as well. The leaves in an oak forest can hold virtually all of the water of a 2-inch downpour. They also slow down water sheeting off a landscape and allow it to percolate into the soil. As they break down and the humus moves into the soil, of course, carbon is sequestered. A study from the University of Maryland found that in gardens where leaves hadn't been removed, soils held on average 32% more carbon. But most relevant here is that so many animals have come to rely on those leaves and the humus just beneath them as habitat. We call that the duff layer, where leaves begin to break down, and go to great lengths to preserve it, because when you rake it out, you are literally raking out a bunch of moths and butterflies. This beautiful giant is a Polyphemus moth at Brooklyn Bridge Park, who overwinters as a cocoon camouflaged as a leaf. And you'd never notice them if you raked those leaves away. Your purple hair streak eats oak leaves when they are caterpillars, and like thousands of lepidopterans, falls to the leaf layer to pupate. Same with this elegant thing, the giant hawk moth. And then, of course, there are the many non-charismatic animals who rely on leaf litter as well, like worms and beetles. They're important even though they're not pink, because they drive ecological networks by providing food to birds like this ovenbird at Brooklyn Bridge Park, who only hangs out on your land when there are leaves and animals within them to root around in. These are often the insects that are in decline. The latest numbers that are on top of the steep declines we've already witnessed show that we are still losing between 1% to 2% of insects per year, which doesn't sound like a lot, but adds up to an additional third of insects in 20 years. Statistics are even worse for formerly abundant species who are declining at 8% per year, and those are the insects that feed the birds, some of whom require 1,000 caterpillars a day to feed their brood. Doug Tallamy calls caterpillars baby food because they're smooshy and packed with protein. They're one of the most important groups of insects to support when considering broader food webs. You might protest that leaving the leaves would look messy, and you'd be right, but is that tidiness worth more than pink moths and songbirds? Plus, I love the way this looks. Japan celebrates this, and we just rake it away for some strange reason. I still love it in the winter at Brooklyn Bridge Park, and for me, just aesthetically, it looks so much better than a sheet of mulch. This is what our land is supposed to look like in December. The leaves are providing a sense of place. In a more formal environment, a foot or two of mulch along the front edge can clean it all up. When you keep the front of your garden neat, and when you give it what we call a cue to care, to let people know that it's not neglected, you can get away with a bit of benign neglect in the rest. We call this the garden mullet. And to be clear, this is still a lot of work. We're not just walking away with romantic notions of letting nature take its course. Some herbaceous plants will grow happily through leaves, while others will faint dead away if 3 leaves get near them. Sometimes leaves harbor pests and diseases and have to be removed. We also try to leave as much of the non-leaf plant material on the ground as possible. We cut back gardens in spring, not fall, in order to provide birds with seeds and overwinterers with warm places to hide. We want those seeds available to birds throughout the year, including in spring, so we cut seed heads off certain perennials during the cutback process and then spread them back on the ground when we're done. This also helps us cultivate the seed bank and suppress weeds. When cutting back larger perennials and grasses, we practice the chop and drop method, which gardener Christina Severin is demonstrating here. And you use shears and you cut back plants in 4 to 6 inch segments, just going bang, 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 down the plant. And then you distribute those cuttings down on the ground and just use that as your mulch. Stems with a center or a pith of 1/8 of an inch or greater are left up 18 inches to 2 feet high so that stem nesting bees can use them the following winter. Entomologist Heather Home calls this stem stubble, and they are better than bee hotels because they don't build up pests and diseases like bee hotels do. Certain asters are very carefully worked around to protect the overwintering caterpillars of the pearl crescent butterfly beneath their basal rosettes. In the summertime, we have clouds of up to 40 of these butterflies flitting through the park as a result of these practices. But we're also interrogating why we cut back at all, and if it's really necessary functionally or even aesthetically. I spoke about this in a TED Talk I did recently, but this sculptural garden was the result of gardener Bella Ciabattoni experimenting with ways to leave hibiscus stems up for the many insects who use them for nesting. We were always walking this fine line between practices that support wildlife and those that the public or my boss would read as too messy. I was initially worried that this would cross the line, but I think it's lovely and resulted in song sparrows nesting at the base of those uncut stems. Similarly, Pavel left all of the milkweed in his zone uncut back one spring, and it looked far too messy, and I told him he had to chop it all down. And it was right at the entrance along a greenway, and it was in a really high-profile location. And the next day, he sent me this video of a red-winged blackbird female stripping the milkweed to make her nest. And as it turns out, milkweed stems are renowned in the bird community for nest making, because you can get these long, strong fibers with compounds that protect chicks from parasites. Orioles will also use them as well to weave their complex nests together. So I let him leave it up. Why would I take that away from the birds? And what a gift to give this sight to an observant child walking by to see a bird making a nest. It's just worth more. So a lot of this is just controlling our impulses to be tidy, like so many people have been saying, and to figure out how to make gardens look gorgeous without it. This is a newish trend also popularized by Heather Holm, in which mulch tree rings are replaced with native ground covers. She calls them soft landings because they provide a place for all of those moths and caterpillars falling from the tree canopy to land in a soft pile in order to pupate. And this picture is a utilitarian soft landing on a lawn in a public park in Boston. But this is one that I designed at Brooklyn Bridge Park that does essentially the same thing. We're all trying to find ways to design and cultivate ecologically functional landscapes that also read as incredibly beautiful to the uninitiated. Many of these plants can go in between shrubs as well, rather than mulch. Pete O'Dolph once said to me that Americans like to display their mulch. And he's right, sadly, but I'm glad it's changing. And we're finding ways to sneak in houseplants for butterflies and flowers for specialist bees in areas that would have, until recently, been maintained as a vacuum to mulch in perpetuity. Some of these green mulch or soft landing plantings can be highly ornamental, like in this Brooklyn Bridge Park garden by gardener Junko Fujimoto, with drifts of phlox and Jacob's ladder. But we were also working on this background 1 to 2 foot tall green matrix that could just be used as an understory underneath the entirety of the park. It's quite diverse and could grow through fallen leaves in spring, and it's made up of dynamic plants with different reproductive strategies who could hold their own or fill in gaps when they appeared. This type of planting can result in a sort of gridlock of stability. This is my front garden in Brooklyn with this cute matrix of short plants around shrubs. It's underneath a large oak tree that I have to pull like 50 seedlings from every summer, but aside from that, I do literally nothing else. There's no weeding, no watering, nothing. And so those were just a few of the practices that we found to be the most helpful. And of course, they may or may not be relevant to where you work. So I thought I should share the methods that we use to develop our strategies, because every garden, even in the same country, is very different and caters to different plant and wildlife communities. It's pretty simple. We essentially just stock our wildlife. We pick an animal who already frequents the park or one who we wanted to attract and research their life cycles. We'd look into what they needed for food, how they get water, the seasons they'd be in the park, the nesting materials they need, and anything that they needed to reproduce. And then we'd figure out how we could provide those resources. Sometimes it was as simple as just leaving them alone. Often it involved planting native plants. For example, the painted lady butterfly was a regular visitor, and we had a few of their host plants, but I wanted to test them all. So I ordered this silver plant called Pearly Everlasting, and immediately upon opening the box, the butterflies just absolutely mobbed it. This is a video of me trying to plant one, and this lady wouldn't stop laying eggs, and we had to brush them off the plants just to get them in the ground. I told this story as a very uplifting story in my TED Talk, and everyone loved it. But what I didn't tell them is that we planted them in spring, and as the caterpillars hatched, they ate the plants to the ground, killed the plants, and all died. And so then we came back and we planted them in the fall, where they would have a chance to get established and it wouldn't get immediately mobbed by butterflies. And so anytime that we discovered something really important like this, we'd add it to one of our massive and very messy databases that are all available on the Brooklyn Bridge Park website. We recorded everything that we researched or observed that we thought was relevant. I also disseminate this information in my newsletter, which, when I have time to write it, is filled with research and resources. And if you'd like, I can put the links to all of these databases in the next one. Similarly, we wanted ruby-throated hummingbirds in the park. They're just magical. They're wonderful, wonderful creatures. And so we planted every red and yellow tubular flower native to the region, hoping to attract them. And it took 7 years. But eventually they showed up on this jewelweed that Pavel planted, and they love it. And it's a beautiful plant, and that dynamic, again, is really, really gorgeous. But still, this plant is considered a weed by the vast majority of gardeners, and it's removed in almost every landscape. We also leave up the seed heads of this Anemone virginiana because I read that the hummingbirds will use the floss of the seeds to weave together their tiny nests of lichen and spider silk. They haven't nested in the park yet, but we leave them up as an invitation. And lastly, a few years ago, Pavel found this blueberry bee who provisions her babies with blueberry pollen. They will use redbud when forced to, but they much prefer blueberries. And they're rare in cities because blueberries like acidic soils and ours trend basic. And so we researched what they need for nesting, and lo and behold, it is sand. And so we dumped sand around the blueberries, again, just as an invitation for nesting. And then we looked up the sightings of the blueberry bee on iNaturalist in New York City. Do you use iNaturalist here? Is it a thing? Great, awesome, wonderful, wonderful. For anyone who hasn't used it, it's one of these identify everything apps, but the real functionality comes from the mapping of verified species, and you can use it to track recent sightings of both plants and wildlife. And so we used it to look up where blueberry bees had been found in New York, and then overlaid that with blueberry plants. And we looked at the populations of blueberry bees that we thought we could link together, and worked with other gardens and cemeteries and public parks, and then even appealed to the public to plant blueberries to link those populations to support them in the city. And the surveying for that effort just started this spring, so I'll report back on that in the future. But this is the sort of thing you can do with iNaturalist. It's incredibly helpful. So again, we were really just supporting these communities however we could. And the most critical community here, of course, were the gardeners themselves. So I just want to state clearly, if I haven't been already, that this is the work of a bunch of people. And when I think of all the things that we accomplished at Brooklyn Bridge Park, the one I'm most proud of is having led this incredible team and created a good place to work, where people feel respected and have room to follow their own interests. And that sounds so obvious, like, of course everybody should have that. But in the US, at least, manual labor has been systematically and strategically devalued, so that it actually becomes quite radical to say, these jobs are important, you're doing valuable work, and we're going to pay you well and treat you with respect. Because you can't order someone to chase around a butterfly. But you can educate and inspire and provide space for them to follow their own passions. You may wonder why we focus so much on butterflies, and it's because everyone loves them. I personally happen to prefer moths, but butterflies are a gateway insect, and they so clearly and beautifully illustrate the possible functionality of our gardens. And the reality is that everyone wants them around, but you just don't get butterflies without the caterpillars, and you don't get the caterpillars without the host plants. And so I will end it on that note. Thank you all so sincerely.